Welcome back to this Teach Out on food sustainability. I'm here again with Dr. Martin Heller to talk about kind of the Paris Climate Accord and carbon emissions and kind of how we think about our food choices and how they impact those overall emissions. So jumping into it, I know that you recently co-authored a study that explored the variability that there is between emissions that are associated with a kind of a variety of American diets. And you found a striking result here that 46% of total emissions from food came from the diets of just 1/5 of the population. Can you tell us a little bit more about that finding and that study?
Sure. So that's utilizing diet data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So this is an ongoing survey that we conduct in the U.S. To ask people about what they're eating and about their health and a lot of other associated questions. But it's really the best source of information in the U.S. that we have for understanding people's diets and what they're eating. The big advantage of using that to look at a question like this is, like you said, we can begin to look at what the spread is rather than just looking at a single number at the average U.S. diet. We can begin to look at how the variation in diets in the U.S. Influence that carbon footprint. And one of the striking things we found is just how much that high-end tail, the diets that are very high in greenhouse gas emissions, contribute to the overall total. So like you said, the top fifth, something like 46% of the total, there's like an 8-fold difference in the contribution from that highest fifth, the highest 20% of the population to the lowest 20% of the population. So pretty big spread there.
Can you tell us a little bit more about these groups and kind of who's in which groups and how you kind of partition that?
Sure, yeah, that's a challenging thing to generalize. I mean, they're partitioned simply by linking environmental impact, linking greenhouse gas emissions associated with producing different foods to those individual diets, and so then assigning a carbon footprint, greenhouse gas emissions associated with that given diet, and then just ranking them based on that total. So that's what gives the order, and then we divide them evenly up into fifths and can start to look at what's going on in those groups. Because of the nature of this data, it's statistical stuff, and it's difficult to just hone in and look at individuals. You kind of have to look at them in some sort of an aggregate. So we can start to look at what's driving those differences. A big part of it is the folks in those high impact diets simply are eating more. That contributes a lot. But even if we normalize by the caloric intake, that difference between the high impact diets and the low impact diets is still a factor of 5. So the composition of the diets between those two groups is a big contributor as well. And largely what we see is the amount of meat, and in particular the amount of beef in the diets is a large driver. So more meat in the high impact diets, more likely to be beef versus poultry in the lower impact diets.
That's helpful. So thinking back to a previous segment where we were talking about how small decisions can have a really, really large positive impact on the environment in terms of your food choices. Looking at that 46%, there's a huge opportunity there to make even marginal changes for that group can have a really big impact.
Yeah, so we just to kind of put those numbers in perspective, we looked at a hypothetical diet shift, just kind of a what if. And what if we were able to bring the greenhouse gas emissions of those upper fifth diets just down to the average of the total population? So if we're thinking about that in terms of food intake, again, picking on beef because that's a big driver of what's going on up there, but the average beef intake in that upper fifth was something like a third of a pound a day. That's a fair amount of beef. The average for the whole population was, I think, 51 grams. So that's something like a quarter pounder every other day, you know. But, you know, that gives you a little sense of the kinds of reductions we're talking about here. Of course, beef isn't the only thing that's driving those changes, but, you know, it's a big part of the driver and gives you a little sense of what the scale is. But what we found is if we were able to bring that upper fifth down to the average and, you know, assume that could happen every day of the year, it would bring us 10% closer to reaching our Paris Accord agreement. So it starts to put in perspective the role that diet shift can have in climate action. That, you know, these net numbers or those types of changes really do matter from sort of the broader perspective of our overall U.S. emissions.
Sure. No, that's really striking, especially you know, thinking about, you know, across all sectors, not just looking at food. I mean, there's so many different behaviors that an individual can change to have a positive impact on their own contribution to carbon emissions, right? So as we're looking for these kind of marginal decreases across the board, they add up.
Exactly.
Which is great. It's really exciting to kind of see those opportunities. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of this concept of food miles. So we're thinking of everyone, you know, a lot of people think about, you know, the transportation associated with food as having a really large kind of emissions impact, right? So we see a kind of movement toward eating local and kind of supporting things that are grown within certain amount of miles from where you live, right?
Yeah.
But I'm curious to hear a little bit more from your perspectives, looking at the life cycle analysis of how food is produced, and also taking into consideration pre-production and production, as you mentioned earlier. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I'd love to start by saying that I'm a huge proponent of local food. You know, I think that growing food among our neighbors, you know, having food and agriculture as part of our community is a huge importance. You know, there's lots of benefits in terms of nutrition and just the quality of food that you can get by having it grown locally. But what we see when we look at sort of these life cycle studies of food production is, on the whole, those transportation miles, those food miles, don't contribute all that much to the overall total. Again, there's a lot more emissions associated with the actual on-farm production, and you know, again, on the whole, the transportation, you know, is probably in the like 5 to 10% of total emissions associated with our food. You know, that's not to say that those food miles don't matter, but if we are going to make a choice of you know, choosing something because it's local or choosing something because it's a low emission food, plant-based food rather than an animal-based food, you're going to see a much greater reduction by choosing a different food than by choosing the local one.
That's great. I mean, that's really helpful. So thinking about, you know, individual changes that we can make to kind of help take that step in the right direction. Thinking about growing a garden in your backyard, right? So going out, and that really cuts down on the food miles, right? So trying to kind of reconnect there to your local food economy in a different way is meaningful. And understanding that, you know, the production is going to be a huge part of where our food comes from and where a lot of the emissions are. But knowing that, you know, wherever you want to buy your food, you have these kind of decision points, right? Mm-hmm. You have these moments where you can kind of weigh those options. So I think the critical thinking skills associated with that are super important. So, you know, from what you've seen in your research, you know, what do you think the best way that we can kind of continue on this path to reduce our carbon emissions is, as it kind of relates to, you know, everything that we've discussed in this segment? Sure.
I really think the two standout pieces are reducing food waste, and that's a tricky one. You know, it means changing our relationship with food in a lot of ways, and changing our behaviors around how we purchase and what our thoughts are about leftovers, and how we prepare food and all of these other bits. But and I also want to make it clear that when I'm talking about reducing food waste, I mean not necessarily just composting it. I mean, that's a great thing, right? If you have to waste food, it's better to dispose of it in a proper way than send it off to the landfill. But again, the impact associated with that, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, comes from production, right? So, regardless of how we dispose it, we've already invested those carbon emissions. So that's a big piece. And the other one is thinking about our diet and the composition of our diet, and eating less animal-based foods. There's plenty of evidence that demonstrate the benefits of that from an environmental perspective as well as a health perspective. I think we're always going to have these sort of cultural discussions about what kind of diet is most health promoting and best for weight reduction and all these other things, and at the end of the day, those are individual choices. But we do know that reducing animal-based foods in your diet can have a notable impact on your carbon footprint.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Martin. And thank you for joining us. We look forward to continuing the conversation and the discussion forums.